President Trump made his first speech to the United Nations General Assembly this morning, and he also made a whole lot of headlines in the process. His comments about North Korea, probably they got the most attention. Take a listen.
Now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. The United States has great strength and patience. But if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Rocket Man. He also went after Iran, and he criticized the Obama administration's nuclear deal with the Iranians.
It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction.
And of course, the president also drove home, and he also tried to explain his America First message.
As President of the United States, I will always put America first. Just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first. All responsible leaders have an obligation to serve their own citizens, and the nation-state remains the best vehicle for elevating the human condition. But making a better life for our people also requires us to work together in close harmony and unity to create a more safe and peaceful future for all people. The United States will forever be a great friend to the world, and especially to its allies.
Now, one thing Trump didn't do is sharply criticize the UN, obviously at the very location he delivered the address from. And that is a major departure from candidate Trump. Take a listen to him just last year.
The United Nations is not a friend of democracy. It's not a friend to freedom. It's not a friend even to the United States of America. The United Nations is an underperformer. When do you see the United Nations solving problems? They don't. They cause problems.
And joining us now to unpack all this is Ted Piccone. He's a senior fellow at Brookings and a former senior foreign policy advisor for the Clinton administration. Ted, as always, thank you for a few minutes.
Thank you.
You know, I heard, of all people, Jeb Bush saying that, you know, at some point Trump, he's got to lay out a coherent foreign policy. Did we get that today? Mixed in with America First was his worldview. Do you think people, whether they liked it or not, left the room today with an idea of what America stands for in the Trump administration?
I think it was probably the most coherent explanation we've heard so far about where Trump wants to go on his foreign policy agenda. But it also had some contradictions built into it, in part because he was trying to speak to many different audiences, including his base. But also within the Republican Party, you have different strands of view on what the role of the U.S. should be. You have the neocons who see a very muscular role for democracy promotion. That clearly was not present in the speech, but there were elements of it. When the talk about rogue regimes, echoes of the Bush agenda of axis of evil, there was religious language about righteous against the wicked. And then, of course, there was a global audience that he was trying to reach to make it clear that the U.S. is going to stay engaged. We do believe in a better UN, a stronger reformed UN, but we want to share the burden. We don't want to be doing it alone.
No one can accuse this president of being too nuanced. North Korea, he talked about their destruction if they weren't compliant with denuclearizing. He talked about the Iran nuclear deal is an embarrassment, and he talked a lot about sovereignty. To that end, you know, they were showing a few folks shaking their heads in the audience. I know there weren't surprises here, but in terms of tone and messaging, yeah, it's muscular, but do people buy it? Do they think he'll actually follow through on what he said, or they're just made for a good speech?
Yeah, some of the language was really over the top, and I thought will give ammunition to groups and other countries that have no interest in working with the United States, and particularly with this president. Trump does have a reputation for bullying and overstretching his demands and his language, and people are now maybe writing him off, that that's just a lot of hot talk, and we'll see what actually happens in reality. And so there's a lot of, remember, this is a very transactional administration, and so it's all going to be case by case and seeing where some sort of pragmatic deal can be done.
When he said the word sovereignty, to some people, that may not have registered as a big deal, but he also talked patriots of nation states. Translate to the general audience, because I think if you're a strongman somewhere, you can say, hey, I'm with you there, Donald, here. I can do whatever I want on my own borders of my country, and I don't have to worry about the U.S. getting involved.
Right. I mean, the word sovereignty in the UN is a very loaded term. There is, of course, the UN itself is built on a body of nation states that are sovereign, and there's a strong emphasis on that. But, traditional sovereignty has gotten eroded over the years through globalization and forms of international cooperation that are actually in each country's self-interest. There's a reason we have treaties to form international cooperation, for example, on combating environmental contamination. However, the traditionalists see national sovereignty as a defense against any UN action or interference in their internal affairs. And that's where I think Trump made a big mistake, that by emphasizing so much the sovereignty concept, he has walked us back away from the good parts of international cooperation and toward this notion of patriotism and, frankly, walls, and it's going to be harder to find any kind of cooperation from the authoritarians because they can just use that as a defense. Look what Trump said.
Also notable in the speech, obviously, Ted, what wasn't said, and that had to do with the Paris Climate Accord. In fact, also today after the speech, Macron was quite critical of that omission in Trump's speech. And you're closer to this than me, but I've had the opportunity this past year, whether it be in Africa or Europe, to travel quite a bit. And what has struck me is something I've never seen in my life before: how many people have gone out of their way with real concern about who the U.S. and what it stands for. In world capitals right now, are they starting to look at Merkel and others to say who's going to provide the leadership if it's America first, and really this administration, this president doesn't want to be involved outside of its borders with the exception of anything that's seen as existential threats? How does the world, I know it's a loaded question, but how does the world largely look at this president, this administration, as it relates to what does America stand for going forward?
I think it's a concern they've had since November 8th. And if anything, this speech may have addressed some of those concerns, because it's clear after yesterday and today's comments by Trump about we want to work with the UN, we're going to be a friend, we're going to want to be a partner. The burden sharing argument is a fair one. So maybe it's not as bad as it initially sounded. It's all a question of your expectations. That said, there's no question that as the U.S. is retreating from a leadership role, other countries are taking notice and filling the vacuum. And Germany is one case. I think they are willing to go only so far. But you have countries like China and Russia with deep pockets that are more than interested and eager to fill that vacuum. And we're seeing that, it's not a brand new phenomenon, but it's only now accelerated, whether it's in the trade area, the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, China is filling that void. On climate change, there are a number of countries that are saying, we're going to go ahead without you, the United States. We don't need you to go forward. And in other areas where that there's no question, some are seeing it as an opportunity, and some are seeing seeing it as a real challenge because they're more focused on their own internal problems and they're not sure they can step up. Or take countries like Brazil and India and South Africa. In the past, they've said, we belong on the Security Council. Well, you're not hearing that as much these days as they're addressing their own problems at home.
Interesting speech, interesting takeaways. Ted, I appreciate a couple. Thank you so much.
Sure, anytime.
And coming up next, the battle over Obamacare not over by a long shot. Republicans still trying to make it work. They call it a Hail Mary pass. But we're going to take a look as to whether or not that Hail Mary's got a good chance of getting complete and the deadlines Republicans could face here to get this thing done before the end of the month. Stay with us.